On Mother's Day, the day I had spent over 30 years being called Mom, my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes and said, "This dinner is for real mothers, not for someone who just sits around and expects gratitude." And the worst part? My son didn't say a word. That was the moment I realized I wasn't losing my place in this family. I had already lost it. I'm Margaret. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I understood exactly what it meant to be a mother. To me, motherhood wasn't something you questioned. It wasn't something you earned once and could lose later. It was something you lived, every day, in quiet sacrifices no one noticed and small acts of love no one thought to thank you for. I became a mother at 26. Back then, life was simpler. Not easier, but clearer. My husband, Richard, and I didn't have much. A small house with peeling paint, a kitchen that always seemed too narrow, and a future that felt uncertain more often than not. But when my son Ethan was born, everything else faded into the background. I still remember the first time I held him. He was so small, fragile. His fingers barely wrapped around mine, but somehow in that moment, I felt something stronger than anything I had ever known. Responsibility, yes, but also purpose. From that day on, my life was no longer just mine. It became his. I was there for everything. The sleepless nights when he cried for hours and nothing seemed to soothe him. The fevers that kept me awake, sitting beside his bed, pressing cool cloths to his forehead. The school mornings when I woke up before sunrise just to make sure he had a proper breakfast, even when we could barely afford groceries that week. Richard worked long hours back then. Construction jobs, mostly. He came home exhausted, his hands rough and worn. So most of the day-to-day raising fell to me. And I didn't mind. Because every time Ethan laughed, every time he ran toward me after school with some small story he couldn't wait to tell, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. We didn't raise him with luxury. We raised him with consistency, with rules, with love. I taught him to say please and thank you. To stand up when someone older entered the room. To respect people, not because they demanded it, but because it was the right thing to do. And for a long time, I believed those lessons stayed with him. Even as he grew older, even as he became successful, even after he married. I remember the day he introduced me to Vanessa. She was beautiful, poised, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately made everything feel more structured, controlled. At first, I told myself that was a good thing. Ethan had always been gentle, thoughtful. Maybe he needed someone stronger beside him. Vanessa was polite to me in the beginning. Not warm, not affectionate, but polite. She called me Margaret instead of Mom. I noticed it, of course. What mother wouldn't? But I told myself not to read too much into it. Relationships take time. Respect, I believed, grows slowly. So I was patient. I welcomed her into our family. I invited them over for dinner every Sunday, just like we used to do when Richard was still alive. I cooked Ethan's favorite meals. I made sure Vanessa always had a seat at the table. Even when I could feel the distance in the way she spoke, the careful tone she used, as if she were always measuring her words. I told myself it would get better. That one day, she would look at me not as an obligation, but as family. And Ethan? He smiled the same way he always had. Warm, reassuring, familiar. Whenever I felt that quiet unease creeping in, the feeling that something had shifted in ways I couldn't quite name, I would look at my son and remind myself. I raised him. I know who he is. That belief stayed with me for years. It stayed with me through small changes I didn't question enough. Through moments I chose to overlook. Through silences that, at the time, didn't seem important. Because when you spend your whole life being a mother, you don't imagine there will come a day when someone looks at you and decides you're no longer one. When my husband Richard passed away, people kept telling me the same thing. Asterisk, at least you still have your son. Asterisk. As if that was supposed to make the silence easier. As if losing one half of your life could somehow be balanced by holding on to another. The house felt different after he was gone. Not just quieter, though it was that too. It felt hollow, like something essential had been removed, leaving behind only the shape of what used to be there. His chair by the window stayed empty. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet exactly where he had left it. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to move anything. Ethan started coming by more often in those first few months. He would sit with me in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes just scrolling through his phone while I made tea. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. And I held on to it tightly, convincing myself that this was what healing looked like. Then Vanessa started coming with him more regularly. At first, I was grateful. I thought she was making an effort, that she understood I shouldn't be alone. She would bring small things, flowers once, a box of pastries another time. Always neat. Always appropriate. Always distant. She never lingered in the kitchen with me the way I had once done with my own mother-in-law. She never asked about Richard. Never mentioned his name, even in passing. It was as if he had never existed. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, the rhythm of our family began to change. Sunday dinners became less frequent. Work has been busy, Ethan would say. Schedules are complicated, Vanessa would add, her tone smooth, practiced. Then the dinners moved. From my house to theirs. It's just easier this way, she explained one evening, standing near my doorway with that polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Easier. Such a simple word. But I remember standing there after they left, looking around my quiet kitchen, realizing something I hadn't expected to feel so soon. I wasn't hosting anymore. I wasn't needed. The first time I went to their house for dinner, I noticed how everything was arranged. The table settings were precise. The food plated neatly. Even the conversation seemed structured. Vanessa led most of it, guiding topics, shifting discussions, filling silences before they could settle naturally. Ethan followed along easily. Too easily. At one point, I started telling a story, something small, about Ethan as a child. A memory that used to make him laugh. Vanessa smiled politely. Then she interrupted. "Oh, that reminds me," she said, turning to Ethan. "Did you confirm the reservation for next weekend?" Just like that, the moment was gone. Ethan didn't return to the story. He didn't even notice it had been cut off. I told myself it was nothing. Just conversation. Just timing. But moments like that began to happen more often. Small things. Easy to dismiss on their own. But together, they started to form a pattern. Holidays changed next. Thanksgiving at their house. Christmas kept small this year. And then Mother's Day. For decades, it had been simple. Breakfast at home. Richard's cinnamon rolls. Ethan's awkward, sleepy smile as he handed me a card he had clearly picked out at the last minute. It wasn't perfect. But it was ours. Now Vanessa had taken that too. "I thought I'd host this year," she said casually over the phone one afternoon. No discussion. No question. Just a decision. "And Ethan?" He agreed. Of course he did. I hung up the phone slowly that day, staring at the wall for a long moment, longer than necessary. Because deep down, somewhere beneath all the explanations I kept giving myself, something didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't just that things were changing. It was how easily they were changing. How quietly my place in this family was being rearranged. And the strangest part? No one ever said it out loud. No arguments. No confrontations. Just a series of small shifts. Until one day, you look around and realize you're no longer standing where you used to be. At first, I told myself it was normal. Families change. Children grow up, build their own lives, create their own routines. I had said those exact words to friends before. Women who sat across from me with quiet sadness in their eyes, wondering why their children didn't call as often, didn't visit like they used to. Give them space. I would say gently. They're just building their own family now. I believed that. I truly did. But there's a difference between building something new and replacing what came before. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that difference. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything shifted. It was gradual, careful, almost invisible. At their house, I started noticing how decisions were made. Vanessa chose the meals. Vanessa set the schedule. Vanessa decided when dinner started, when it ended, even what we talked about. And Ethan? He followed. Not reluctantly. Not unhappily. Just naturally. as if that had always been his place. The first time I truly felt it was during a small conversation. So small that anyone else might have forgotten it within minutes. We were sitting at the table, finishing dinner. I mentioned that I was thinking of repainting the kitchen. Something lighter, maybe. Soft cream instead of the old pale yellow Richard and I had chosen years ago. I think it would brighten the space, I said. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. Yeah, that sounds nice, Mom. But Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying me. You're still keeping that house? She asked. The question caught me off guard. Of course, I replied. I've lived there for over 40 years. She smiled. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. It's just a lot for one person, she said. Maintenance, taxes, upkeep. It might make more sense to downsize. Downsize. I remember the word settling into the room like something heavier than it should have been. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He just took a sip of his drink, as if this was a perfectly reasonable conversation to be having. I forced a small smile. I'm managing just fine. Vanessa nodded, still smiling. I'm sure you are, she said. I just think it's important to be practical. Practical. Another small word. Another quiet shift. The conversation moved on after that. But something inside me didn't. Because it wasn't really about the house. Not entirely. It was about how easily my life, my choices, my space, had become something open for discussion. Something negotiable. After that, I started paying closer attention. And once you start noticing things, it becomes harder to stop. Ethan began calling less. Not dramatically less. Just enough that I noticed. When we spoke, the conversations felt shorter. More efficient. As if he were checking something off a list rather than reaching out, because he wanted to. Vanessa, on the other hand, became more present, but not in a way that felt comforting. She asked questions. About my finances. About the house. About my plans for the future. Always framed politely. Always with that same measured tone. But underneath it, there was something else. Something calculating. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't point to anything specific and say this is wrong. But I felt it. The way you feel a draft in a room even when all the windows appear closed. And the strangest part was Ethan. My son. The boy I had raised to be kind, attentive, respectful. He didn't see it. Or maybe he did. And chose not to. Because every time Vanessa spoke, every time she redirected a conversation, every time she subtly repositioned something that had once belonged to me, he let her. Without question. Without hesitation. And that was when a thought first crossed my mind. Quiet, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Maybe this wasn't just about change. Maybe this was about control. And maybe I had already started losing mine. The message came on a Tuesday afternoon. Short. Clean. Efficient. Just like everything Vanessa did. Dinner at our place this Sunday. 6 p.m. Could you bring dessert? That was it. No greeting. No quorums. Not even a simple asterisk. Happy early Mother's Day. Asterisk. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering just above the reply button. For a second, I thought maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was another message. A follow-up. A small attempt at kindness tucked somewhere between the lines. There wasn't. Just instructions. I typed back slowly. Of course. I'll bring something nice. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then disappeared. Then nothing. No thank you. No acknowledgement. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and looked around the room. The afternoon light was soft, stretching across the floor the way it always did this time of day. It used to be my favorite hour. Quiet. Peaceful. The kind of stillness that made a house feel like a home. But that day, it felt different. Too quiet. Too empty. Mother's Day. For decades, it had never required planning. It simply happened. Richard would wake up early trying, never very successfully, to keep quiet in the kitchen. The smell of cinnamon rolls would drift down the hallway, pulling me out of sleep before he ever made it to the bedroom door. Ethan, still half asleep, would follow behind him, pretending he wasn't involved in the whole thing. And then they would both stand there, awkward and proud, holding breakfast like it was something far more important than it really was. "Happy Mother's Day," Richard would say. Every year. Without fail. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memory settle. Because now, instead of waking up to laughter and the clatter of dishes in my own kitchen, I was being invited to someone else's table, given a time, assigned a role, bring dessert. It was such a small thing, so easy to accept, so easy to explain away. But the more I thought about it, the more something inside me tightened. Because this wasn't just about dinner. It was about ownership. About who this day belonged to now. The rest of the week passed slowly. I kept myself busy, the way I always did when something felt unsettled, but I couldn't quite name why. Laundry, cleaning, small errands that filled time but didn't really require thought. Still, the message lingered in the back of my mind. Sunday, 6 p.m. Bring dessert. By Thursday, I had already decided what I would make. Apple pie. Ethan's favorite. It had always been Ethan's favorite. Even when he was a little boy, he would sit on the kitchen counter, swinging his legs while I peeled apples, stealing slices when he thought I wasn't looking. "Best pie in the world," he used to say. I smiled faintly at the memory. Some habits don't leave you no matter how much time passes. So on Saturday morning, I went to the market. I took my time choosing the apples. Firm. Crisp. Just slightly tart. The way Richard always said they should be. The woman at the register smiled at me as she rang them up. "Baking for Mother's Day?" she asked cheerfully. I hesitated for just a second. Then I smiled back. "Yes," I said. Something like that. Sunday morning arrived quietly. No phone call. No message. No Happy Mother's Day. I told myself they were busy. That they were planning something. That maybe, just maybe, there would be a moment later that would make all of this feel different. I started baking early. Not because I needed the time, but because baking had always been the way I showed love. Flour on the counter. Butter softening near the window. The familiar rhythm of slicing, mixing, rolling. For a little while, everything felt the way it used to. Safe. Meaningful. Like I still knew my place. But as I placed the pie into the oven and closed the door gently, a quiet thought slipped into my mind. Uninvited, but impossible to ignore. This time, I wasn't baking for my family. I was bringing something. To theirs. I woke up before sunrise that morning. Not because I had to. There was no one waiting in the kitchen. No small footsteps in the hallway. No husband trying to quietly open cabinets without waking me. Failing every single time. Old habits don't disappear. Even when the life they belong to is long gone. I lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. It was the kind of silence you get used to over time, but never quite make peace with. Mother's Day. For a moment, I let myself imagine it would feel different. That maybe my phone would ring. That Ethan's name would appear on the screen, his voice warm and familiar, saying the same words he had said for decades. Asterisk, Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Asterisk. But the phone remained still on the nightstand. No sound. No message. Just silence. I got up slowly and made my way to the kitchen. The morning light hadn't fully settled yet. It stretched faintly across the floor, soft and pale, like it wasn't quite ready to commit to the day. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, wrapping both hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. Outside, everything looked normal. Neighbors moving about their routines. A car passing slowly down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barking. The world didn't pause for days like this. It never does. I checked my phone again. Nothing. I told myself it was still early. That people sleep in on Sundays. That there would be time later. There's always later, I thought. Until there isn't. By 8 o'clock, I had already tied my apron around my waist. The apples sat neatly on the counter where I had left them the night before. Red and green, polished and perfect, like they were waiting for something meaningful to happen. I reached for one, and began peeling it slowly. The motion was familiar. Comforting. Knife against skin. Thin strips curling away. The quiet rhythm of something I had done hundreds, maybe thousands of times before. For years, this had been my language. I didn't always say what I felt. I cooked it. I baked it. I placed it gently in front of the people I loved and trusted that they would understand. As I worked, memories came back in small pieces. Ethan at 5 years old, standing on a chair beside me, insisting he could help, dropping more flour on the floor than into the bowl. Ethan at 10, stealing apple slices and running down the hallway when I pretended to scold him. Ethan at 17, taller than me, leaning against the counter, telling me about his day in that half-distracted way teenagers do, but still choosing to be there. I paused for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the counter. There had been a time when this kitchen felt full, not just of people, of meaning. The pie came together slowly, dough rolled out with careful precision, apples layered just right, cinnamon sprinkled evenly, the scent already beginning to rise before it even reached the oven. I placed the top crust gently over the filling, pressing the edges the way I always had. Some things you never forget, even when everything else changes. By the time the pie was in the oven, the house smelled warm, familiar, almost like the past had found a way to linger for a little while longer. I wiped my hands on a towel and glanced at the clock. 10:17 a.m. Still nothing. No call. No message. No acknowledgement of the day at all. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't doing this for recognition, that I never had. But as I stood there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the soft hum of the oven and the ticking of the clock on the wall, I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something heavier. The slow, undeniable realization that this day that had once belonged to me, was already moving forward. Without me. I left the house a little earlier than necessary. Not because I was in a hurry, but because sitting there any longer, waiting for something that clearly wasn't coming, felt harder than simply moving forward. The pie had cooled by then. I wrapped it carefully, the way I always did, making sure the edges of the crust wouldn't be disturbed. It sat in my hands as I walked to the car, warm through the fabric, familiar in a way that almost made me hesitate. For a brief moment, I considered turning back, setting it down on the kitchen counter, spending the evening alone, the way the day had begun. But habits are strong, and hope, no matter how small, is stubborn. So I got in the car and drove. The streets were quieter than usual. Sunday evenings tend to carry a different kind of silence. Softer, slower, as if the world itself is preparing to begin again. I drove past places that held pieces of my life without thinking much about them. The small park where Ethan learned to ride his bike. The grocery store where I had once stretched every dollar, calculating what we needed versus what we could afford. The corner cafe Richard and I used to visit on weekends, back when time felt like something we had plenty of. All of it still there. Unchanged. Only I was different now. Vanessa and Ethan's house came into view sooner than I expected. It always looked perfect. Neatly trimmed lawn. Clean windows. The kind of place that felt more like a photograph than a home. Everything in its place. Everything carefully arranged. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a second, my hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the front window, I could see movement. Shadows passing. Lights already on. They had started without me. Of course they had. I stepped out of the car, picking up the pie with both hands, and walked toward the door. Before I could knock, it opened. Vanessa stood there, dressed neatly, as always. Her hair pulled back, her expression composed, as if she had been expecting me at that exact second. "Margaret," she said, stepping aside just enough to let me in. "No es mal. No worms. Just acknowledgement. You're right on time." I nodded slightly. I didn't want to be late. The house smelled of food, roasted vegetables, something savory I couldn't quite place, and a faint hint of wine in the air. Everything was already set. The table arranged with precision. Plates aligned perfectly. Glasses placed exactly where they should be. There was no space for improvisation here. No room for anything unexpected. Ethan was in the dining room, scrolling through his phone. He looked up briefly when I entered. "Hey Mom," he said. Just that. No hook. No pause. No happy Mother's Day. I smiled anyway. I moved toward the kitchen, setting the pie gently on the counter. I brought dessert, I said, though it was already obvious. Vanessa glanced at it briefly. Good, she replied. We'll serve it later. Not thank you. Just noted. We sat down shortly after. 3 plates. 3 chairs. And yet, somehow, it felt like there was less space than there should have been. The conversation started normally enough. Work. Schedules. Plans for the upcoming week. Vanessa spoke easily, guiding the flow without effort. Ethan responded when needed, occasionally adding something of his own, but mostly following her lead. I listened, nodded, answered when spoken to. But there was a distance in the room I couldn't ignore. Not loud, not obvious, just present. At one point, I reached for my glass, only to realize it was empty. Before I could say anything, Vanessa stood. I'll take care of that, she said, already moving. She poured the wine with careful precision, filling Ethan's glass first. Then her own. Mine last. It was such a small thing. So easy to overlook. But I noticed it anyway. Because when you've spent your life at the center of a family, you learn exactly what it feels like when you've been moved to the edge. Dinner continued. Polite. Orderly. Controlled. And as I sat there, hands folded lightly in my lap, listening to conversations that no longer seemed to include me the way they once had, a quiet thought settled in my mind. This wasn't my place anymore. Not really. I was simply invited into it. And somehow, that realization felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because it meant something I hadn't been ready to admit. I hadn't just lost control. I had lost belonging. For a while, everything continued as if nothing was wrong. Plates passed from one side of the table to the other. Silverware clinked softly against porcelain. Vanessa spoke about a new project she was working on. Her voice smooth and confident, filling the space effortlessly. Ethan nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, occasionally checking his phone when he thought no one was paying attention. And I sat there, smiling when appropriate, listening, waiting, because a small part of me, still hopeful, still foolish, kept expecting it. A pause. A moment. A simple sentence. Asterisk, Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Asterisk. But it never came. I don't remember exactly what led into it. That's the strange thing about moments that change everything. They don't always arrive with warning. Sometimes they slip into the room quietly, disguised as ordinary conversation. Vanessa set her fork down gently against her plate. I think it's important, she began, her tone calm, almost thoughtful, to recognize people properly. Ethan glanced up briefly. What do you mean? He asked. She smiled slightly. The roles people actually play in our lives, she said. Not just titles. Something about the way she said it made my fingers tighten slightly around my napkin. But I stayed silent. Vanessa turned her gaze toward me. Not abruptly. Not aggressively. Just deliberately. You know, she continued, Mother's Day can be a bit misleading sometimes. The room felt smaller. Quieter. Even the faint sounds from outside, the passing cars, the distant hum of the neighborhood, seemed to fade into the background. Ethan didn't react. He simply waited. Vanessa folded her hands neatly on the table. This dinner, she said, her voice steady, is really meant to celebrate real mothers. And then, she looked directly at me. Not with anger. Not even with cruelty. But with something colder. Certainty. And not someone who just sits around, expecting gratitude. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The words didn't land all at once. They came slowly, like something sinking through water before finally settling at the bottom. Heavy, unavoidable, final. No one spoke. Not immediately. I felt the air shift in the room, like something invisible had cracked open between us. I looked at Ethan. I don't know why. Maybe because after everything, some part of me still believed he would say something. That he would laugh awkwardly and brush it off. Or correct her. Or at the very least look uncomfortable. But he didn't. He didn't laugh. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at me. His gaze stayed fixed on the table, his jaw tightening slightly as if he were concentrating on something far less important than what had just been said. That silence. It was louder than anything Vanessa could have said. I became aware of my own breathing. Slow. Controlled. Careful. The way you breathe when you're trying to hold something together that is quietly breaking inside your chest. I placed my napkin down beside my plate. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. I had spent too many years learning how to stay composed, how to absorb discomfort without letting it show. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, as if she had simply stated something obvious, something reasonable, something that didn't require further explanation. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad choice of words. This wasn't even about Mother's Day. This was about position, about who mattered, and who didn't. I lifted my eyes from the table and looked at her, really looked at her, at the calm expression, at the quiet confidence, at the complete absence of hesitation. Then I looked at my son one more time, waiting, just in case, just for a second. But he never moved. And that was when it happened. Not the anger. Not the tears. Something else. Something quieter. Colder. Stronger. The moment I stopped waiting for him to choose me. For a long moment no one moved. The room remained exactly as it had been. Plates half full, glasses resting on the table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting everything in a warm, almost peaceful tone. But nothing felt warm anymore. Something had shifted. Irreversibly. I didn't speak. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. There was no misunderstanding to correct. No argument to win. No explanation that would change what had just happened. I had spent years believing that respect could be preserved through patience. That if I stayed kind, stayed present, stayed understanding, things would eventually fall back into place. But sitting there, looking at the two people I had once considered my entire world, I realized something simple and devastating. Respect that has to be earned back is usually already gone. I reached for my glass slowly and took a small sip. The wine tasted different. Flat. Unfamiliar. Or maybe it was just me. Vanessa had already moved on. She picked up her fork again, continuing her meal as if nothing significant had happened. As if she hadn't just drawn a line across the table and placed me firmly on the other side of it. Ethan followed her lead. A small movement. A quiet decision. He lifted his glass, took a sip, and just like that, the moment was over. At least for them. But for me, it had only just begun. I looked down at my plate. I hadn't eaten much. I hadn't even noticed. Because my mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Not to anger. Not to hurt. But to memory. Years. Decades. All the mornings I woke up early so Ethan wouldn't have to start his day alone. All the nights I stayed up, waiting for him to come home safely, long after he was old enough to take care of himself. All the times I chose him over sleep, over comfort, over my own needs, without ever thinking twice about it. Not because I expected anything in return, but because that's what being a mother meant to me. And now I was sitting at a table where that entire history had been reduced to something optional, something debatable. I let out a slow breath. Not shaky, not emotional, just steady. Then carefully, I placed my fork down beside my plate. The sound was soft, barely noticeable, but it felt louder to me than anything that had been said that evening. I think I should go, I said. My voice didn't tremble. It surprised me how calm it sounded. Ethan looked up then. Finally, a flicker of something crossed his face. Confusion maybe, or discomfort. Mom, we haven't had dessert yet, he said, glancing briefly toward the kitchen. The pie. Of course. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. That's all right, I replied gently. You can have it without me. Vanessa didn't argue, didn't apologize, didn't even pretend to soften what had happened. She simply nodded once, as if my leaving fit neatly into whatever structure she had already decided for the evening. I stood up slowly, smoothed my hands over my lap. A habit. Something to do with my hands, so they wouldn't reveal too much. For a brief second, I looked at Ethan again. Really looked at him. At the man he had become. At the space between us that no longer felt temporary. And in that quiet moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. I wasn't walking away from a single conversation. I was walking away from the illusion I had been holding on to for years. "I'll see myself out," I said softly. No one stopped me. And somehow, that hurt less than I thought it would, because by then I already knew. There was nothing left there waiting for me to stay. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Not because of traffic. Not because I was lost. But because something inside me had gone quiet in a way I didn't recognize. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't reach for my phone. I just drove. Hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road, moving through familiar streets that suddenly felt distant. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Still. Silent. Waiting. For years, I had feared this kind of quiet. Associated it with loneliness. With absence. With loss. But as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, I realized something unexpected. This silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt honest. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The faint scent of cinnamon still lingered in the air from the morning's baking. Warm. Familiar. Unchanged. I stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, letting the quiet settle around me. No tensión. No careful conversations. No need to measure my words or read between someone else's. Just stillness. I set my keys down on the table and walked slowly into the kitchen. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The clean counter. The folded towel. The space where the pie had been. For a brief second, I imagined it still there. Golden crust. Cooling on the rack. Waiting to be shared. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because I was tired, but because I needed a moment to understand what I was feeling. And the truth was, I wasn't as broken as I thought I would be. There was no rush of tears. No overwhelming grief. No anger clawing its way to the surface. Just clarity. Quiet. Unavoidable clarity. For years, I had been adjusting. Shifting. Explaining things away. Telling myself that change was natural. That distance was temporary, that love, real love, would always find its way back to where it belonged. But tonight had taken all of those explanations and stripped them down to something simple. Something undeniable. I hadn't been slowly losing my place. I had been slowly giving it away. Piece by piece. Dinner by dinner. Silence by silence. Every time I chose not to speak. Every time I accepted less than what I knew I deserved. Every time I convinced myself that keeping the peace mattered more than being seen. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting in my lap, and for the first time in a long time, I asked myself a question I had avoided. What do I want now? Not what Ethan needed. Not what Vanessa expected. Not what a good mother was supposed to tolerate. Just me. The answer didn't come all at once, but it began to take shape. Slowly. Clearly. I didn't want to sit at tables where I had to earn my place. I didn't want to be included out of obligation. I didn't want to shrink myself to fit into someone else's version of family. I had spent decades building a life, a home, a sense of belonging, and somewhere along the way, I had allowed that to be reduced to something conditional. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights had come on. Soft pools of light stretching across the pavement. The world moving forward as it always does. And in that quiet moment, I made a decision. Not out of anger. Not out of pain. But out of something far more solid. Self-respect. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to chase after a place in a family that no longer made space for me. I was simply going to stop. Stop reaching. Stop waiting. Stop pretending that things were still what they used to be. Because the truth was, they weren't. And maybe they hadn't been for a long time. I turned away from the window and looked around my kitchen. My home. My space. Still mine. Still filled with the life I had built. And for the first time that day, I felt something steady settle deep inside me. Not loss. Not loneliness. Freedom. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset, but because my mind for the first time in years felt clear. There were no questions left. No, maybe I misunderstood. No, it'll get better. Just truth. Quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always did. 6:15 a.m. Some habits don't change, even when everything else does. I made my coffee, stood by the window, and watched the sunlight slowly stretch across the yard. It felt like any other day. And yet it wasn't. Because something inside me had shifted. Permanently. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check for messages. I already knew there wouldn't be any. And strangely, that didn't disappoint me anymore. Instead, I walked down the hallway toward a door I hadn't opened in a while. Richard's old office. The room still carried traces of him. Not in any obvious way. No lingering scent, no visible signs of life, but in the quiet order he had always kept. The desk. The drawers. The files arranged exactly the way he liked them. For years, I had left everything untouched. Not because I didn't need to go in there, but because opening that door felt like reopening something I wasn't ready to face. But that morning, I was ready. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. The air felt still, undisturbed, like time had paused here while everything else moved on. I walked to the desk and sat down slowly. For a moment, I just rested my hands on the surface, letting the memory of him settle around me. Richard had always been careful, not just with money, with planning, with making sure that whatever happened, I would be taken care of. Just in case, he used to say. I never liked that phrase. It felt unnecessary, distant, as if preparing for something I didn't want to imagine. But now, I understood. I opened the top drawer. Inside were folders, documents, neatly labeled, organized in a way that only Richard could manage. I pulled one out slowly, then another. House, accounts, investments, everything was there, exactly as he had left it, exactly as he had planned. And for the first time, I didn't look at those papers as something overwhelming, or intimidating, or something I would deal with later. I looked at them as something else entirely. Control. Not the kind Vanessa had. Not the kind built on subtle pressure and quiet manipulation. Real control. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. I sat there for a long moment, flipping through the pages carefully, reading, understanding, remembering the conversations Richard and I had once had about all of this. Conversations I hadn't paid enough attention to at the time, because I thought we had more time. We never think about how important certain things are, until we have to. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the desk. Not hurried, not uncertain. Deliberate. Because something had become very clear to me. For years, I had allowed my place in my own life to become negotiable. Something others could question. Something others could reshape. But that ended now. I stood up and walked toward the door, pausing for just a second before opening it. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about alignment. About making sure that what I had built, what Richard and I had built, stayed exactly where it belonged. With me. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't reacting to what others had done. I was deciding what would happen next. I didn't call Ethan. Not that day. Not the next. And when my phone remained silent, I didn't feel the urge to fill that silence anymore. For years, I had been the one to reach out first. To check in. To maintain the connection. To make sure nothing drifted too far apart. But relationships, real ones, don't survive on one person holding everything together. And I was done holding. 3 days later, I made an appointment. Not with Ethan. Not with Vanessa. With my lawyer. His office hadn't changed. Same quiet building. Same neutral walls. Same faint scent of paper and polished wood that always reminded me of conversations people didn't take lightly. He greeted me with a polite nod, gesturing for me to sit. "Margaret," he said. "What can I help you with today?" I placed my purse carefully on the chair beside me and folded my hands in my lap. For a brief moment, I thought about how different this would have felt a week ago. Heavy, emotional, difficult. But now it felt necessary. "I'd like to review everything," I said calmly. "The house, the accounts, the will." He studied me for a second, just long enough to notice the shift. People who work in his profession are good at that. They recognize when something isn't just paperwork, when it's a decision. "Of course," he replied, reaching for a folder. "We can go through it together." We spent the next hour reviewing details, numbers, ownership structures, beneficiaries. All the things I had once trusted would simply work themselves out, because they always had. But this time I paid attention. Every line, every condition, every name. When he reached the section about inheritance, he paused slightly. "Currently," he said, "your estate is set to transfer entirely to your son." Of course it was. That had never been a question. Not in my mind. Not in Richard's. Everything we built had always been for him. I nodded slowly. Then I spoke. "I'd like to make some changes." He didn't react. Didn't question. Just waited. "The house stays in my name," I continued. "No transfers. No shared ownership. Not now, not later." He made a note. Understood. "And the rest?" I paused briefly, choosing my words carefully. I want it structured differently. We discussed options, trusts, allocations, protections. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because for the first time, I understood something I should have recognized long ago. Love does not require you to make yourself vulnerable to disrespect. By the time we finished, everything was in place. Documented, clear, unambiguous. I signed the final paper with a steady hand. No hesitation. No second thoughts. When I stood up to leave, my lawyer gave a small nod. "If you need anything else," he said, "don't hesitate to reach out." I smiled politely. "Thank you," I replied. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because anything had been taken away, but because something had been secured. For years, I had believed that being a good mother meant giving without limits, without conditions, without boundaries. But walking down those steps, I realized something far more important. A mother can give everything, and still deserve to keep something for herself. And for the first time in a very long time, I had made sure that I did. The message came a week later. Short. Unexpected. "Mom, can we talk?" I was standing in the kitchen when I saw it, the morning light stretching across the same counter where I had stood so many times before, waiting, hoping, adjusting. But this time, I didn't rush to answer. I finished pouring my coffee, took a slow sip, then I set the cup down and read the message again. A week ago, those words would have meant everything. They would have pulled me back immediately, into concern, into readiness, into that familiar instinct to fix whatever had gone wrong. But now they were just words. I replied simply, "You can come by this afternoon." He arrived earlier than I expected, standing at the door, shifting his weight slightly the way he used to when he was younger. Uncertain but trying not to show it. For a brief moment, I saw the boy I had raised. Not the man who had sat silently at that table. Just my son. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was softer than usual. Careful. "Come in," he replied. We sat in the living room. The same room where he had played as a child. Where Richard used to read the newspaper. Where life had once felt simple and whole. Now it felt different. Not broken. Just clearer. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "I've been thinking," he began, "about last Sunday." I didn't say anything. I let him continue. What Vanessa said, he hesitated. It came out wrong. I watched him quietly, not interrupting, not helping him find the words. She didn't mean it the way it sounded, he added quickly. There it was. The explanation. The softening. The attempt to reshape something that had been perfectly clear when it happened. I nodded once. I understood exactly how it sounded, I said calmly. He looked at me then. Really looked. And I saw it. The shift. The realization that something wasn't the same anymore. I should have said something, he admitted. A pause. I just didn't want to make things worse. I let that settle in the room, because for years that had been my reasoning too. And did staying silent make it better? I asked gently. He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It wasn't something to fill or fix. It was simply honest. I'm not angry, Ethan, I said after a moment. And I meant it. I'm just no longer confused. He frowned slightly. I don't understand. I gave a small, calm smile. I spent a long time believing my place in this family was permanent, I said. That no matter how things changed, it would always be there. I paused. But now I see that it isn't something you keep, just because it used to exist. He sat back slightly, absorbing that. I didn't stop being your mother, I continued softly. But somewhere along the way, you stopped treating me like one. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. The truth rarely does. I'm not asking you to choose sides, I added. And I'm not asking you to fix anything. I met his eyes steadily. I'm just choosing something different for myself. What does that mean? He asked quietly. It means I won't sit at tables where I'm not respected, I said. It means I won't shrink myself to make things comfortable for other people. A small pause. And it means I'm done waiting to be valued. He looked down at his hands. For the first time since he arrived, he didn't have an answer. And that was all right. Because this conversation wasn't about changing him. It was about no longer changing myself. After a while he stood. I'll talk to Vanessa, he said. I nodded. You can do whatever you feel is right. At the door he hesitated. Then quietly, Happy Mother's Day, Mom. The words came late. But they came. I looked at him for a moment. Then I smiled. Not the same way I used to. Not out of relief. Not out of longing. But out of understanding. Thank you, I said gently. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not an apology. Not approval. Not a return to what used to be. Because I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding for so long. I had never stopped being a real mother. They had simply forgotten what that meant. And now, I no longer needed them to remember.